This is Dan Schneider, and on this Dan Schneider video interview, I will be talking with two writers, Greg Hanlon and Noah Davis, who have written for the SB Nation sports website and have done sports essays. We'll be talking about sports writings, their writing career, and what was contained in their essays, and that'll be in just a moment. Nation sports site, and for people who don't know, that's a website that's more fan based than things like ESPN and Sports Illustrated, more traditional websites. That and Bleacher Report are probably the two biggest ones. And one of the things that I was taken with was that in an age where journalism is more than yellow, I found a consistently high level of writing in the essay format on SB Nation on a number of topics in sports, and it was quite a high percentage, and both of you had contributed pieces there. So let me start off with Greg, and let me, if you could tell the audience a little bit about yourself, your writing career, both as a sports writer and or in general. So Greg.
Yeah, I've been writing, I guess, since since college or a little bit after. It took me a while to sort of figure out that was what I wanted to do. But I've been in traditional, print journalism and newspapers, and I've sort of bounced um, from that world into the kind of politics and nonprofit world. Obviously, it's hard to make a living in journalism. Not that the politics nonprofit world is particularly. Yeah, I mean, I've tried to, I've always kind of kept a toe in journalism and in writing. And maybe about 6 months ago, I quit my day job, which was at a community nonprofit in Brooklyn, actually, and sort of went into freelance writing full time. So I do some sports stuff. I try to do some politics stuff, and kind of mostly, deep dive, long form stuff.
Yeah.
I guess is the popular word, long form. Um, but I try to, sort of combine deep reporting with sort of character analysis and storytelling, and that's the type of writing that I like to do.
Yeah, I know the two pieces of yours that caught my eye were basically two falls from graces of athletes who were well known in the New York area back in the 1990s. Dave Meggett, a running back for the New York Giants, and Mel Hall, an outfielder for the New York Yankees. And we'll get a bit more in depth on both how you approach writing that and their actual subject matter. So, do you now write for the things like Politico, online stuff, or do you more mainstream journals or whatever comes along?
Yeah, well, I've been doing some stuff recently for Sports Illustrated. Most freelance writers will tell you this, but kind of whoever will give you a contract is the person that you're writing for, is the entity that you're writing for. So I've done some stuff for Sports Illustrated. I used to write a lot for Capital New York, which is related to Politico. To sort of a political culture website in New York City. Um, but yeah, I mean, you mentioned the fall from grace stories with the Meggett and the Hall, and those are kind of stories that a genre of stories that generally interest me for whatever reason. I find just the arc very compelling and just sort of fertile ground to get into a lot of the issues surrounding sports. And I think Noah would obviously probably tell you the same thing, but to the extent that we're sports writers, we're not really so interested in who wins and who loses, at least for the purposes of 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 what we do.
Um,
Um,
Go ahead.
so I think we sort of like to use sports as a window into kind of larger themes about about people in general, about the culture, about just sort of the nature of sports and its place in society.
Noah, now you let me ask the same of you. You actually have a website online, and I guess that features links to various writings. Are you as well? Do you consider yourself mostly a writer, or do you consider yourself mostly a sports journalist, or somewhere in between?
I'd like to think of myself as a writer, but I don't know. I mean, I think I think sometimes you're a writer, sometimes you're a journalist. It's all sort of wrapped up in the same thing. I mean, I'm not, I don't write novels, so I think I'd like to do. I like the reporting, and I think you talked about sort of how the high quality of SB Nation, and I think a lot of that is because there's not a lot of people doing reporting out there, and I think that's one of the things that excuse me that I've really tried to do is go out and talk to people, and rather than just kind of sitting on my couch and having a hot take or something like that. So I like the journalist title, I like the writer title. It's all sort of the same thing, I think, to me.
Now, your story that caught my eye was on the former goalkeeper of the New York Cosmos, Shep, and that was whereas Greg's pieces were more sort of digging into sort of it wasn't as gloomy as the Meggett and Hall pieces. Um, do you find yourself drawn to any certain kind of topics, or like with Greg, is it basically whatever comes along? And do you also write mostly? I mean, do you also write outside of the sports genre for politics or local interest angles, or if there's a whale hunt being nearby that people are protesting, do you write about that as well?
Yeah, I mean, I write about a lot of different things. I think what I'm drawn to generally is sort of topics that a lot of other people aren't writing about. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I do a lot of soccer writing. I got into soccer, partially because I'm interested in soccer, but also because there aren't a huge number of people writing about soccer in the U.S. and there certainly weren't 8 or 10 years ago when I started. I read a lot about sports, but very infrequently about sort of the NFL, the NBA, Major League Baseball. I do sort of underground sports or sports that there aren't a lot of people. I did a piece about cyclocross, which is this crazy kind of tough mudder for biking, and I like doing that because the athletes are a lot more interesting to talk to. They're less media trained. It's easier to get them to say interesting things. They're sports related. To do some politics. I write for Vice. I do some sort of culture stories. For lack of a better term, kind of dude writing. Things that guys are interested in, sort of gadgets and girls and sports and stuff like that.
Now, for younger people who might be watching this and want to get into either journalism in general or sports writing particularly, how do these kind of stories come about? Do you, for example, Noah, or are you a old time Shep Messing fan? You say, I'd love to do a story about Shep Messing, and then try to contact Messing, do the story, and then try to sell the story, or do you go to an SB Nation or Daily News or whatever the local paper is? What are the mechanics behind that?
Yeah, I mean, it happens in a lot of different ways. The Shep Messing story, that was actually Glenn Stout, who's the editor of the SB Nation long form. He was interested in Shep, and so he sort of suggested that. But the first story that I did for him was a story about the last soccer championship of the Third Reich, sort of as the Allies were coming up after D-Day. They were coming up to Berlin, and there was a soccer game, the precursor to the Bundesliga, which is the German soccer league now. They had a final, and they put it on between two teams, and they didn't tell anyone because they didn't want the Allies to bomb the stadium in Berlin. But 60,000 people ended up showing up. So that was the first one that I did for him, and someone had told me about that. I have a friend who lives in Germany, and he had mentioned it, and it seemed like a really sort of amazing story about just kind of the contrast of this trying to contain it, trying to keep everyday life going on in Berlin while in the throes of war and with the Allies coming up. So he just sort of mentioned it offhand to me, and I looked into it a little bit, and I did enough research to know that that game existed and that there was a story there, and that there would be enough information for me to report it. And at that point, I pitched it to a number of different places, and nobody really wanted it because everyone was sort of like, this is a great story, but there's no kind of time hook for this. It's just sort of, this is just kind of a thing that happened. And then when SB Nation started the long form section, I thought, oh, that might be really good for them. And so I emailed a pitch to Glenn, and 5 minutes later he called me back and said, this is perfect, let's do it. So that's how it happened.
How about you, Greg? How did like the two stories on Hall and Megget come about, and are they typical of how your business model works, or were they atypical?
Yeah, I mean, I guess my business model, and Noah and the rest of us would probably say the same thing, is basically just like hustle your rear end off and kind of,
Yep.
any sort of fragment of thought, kind of, pursue that until, until that you can't do something with it, and until then assume that you can do something with it. And that's kind of all, the only, I mean, I wish it was sort of a more kind of measured approach, but you just kind of have to get on your horse and get after things, in this business. So with the Megan thing, I guess what kind of I found compelling about it is that I grew up a huge Giants fan, and I kind of knew vaguely that Meggett got himself in trouble and that he did something bad, involving women. It didn't. I didn't know whether it was like sort of a domestic violence thing or, a paternity suit thing. I knew that he screwed up, and I knew that it involved women. And then when I read about, just a couple Google searches, I read that he was like a serial like rapist. It was disturbing to me that I didn't think of him as this terrible guy, that I thought of him as someone that like screwed up, like as if he had like, you know, made a mistake on like a math test. You know how the athletes always say, I made
Yeah.
mistakes, as if like they, did their long division wrong.
Yeah, my penis just accidentally entered her.
Right. So it was disturbing to me that I didn't sort of think of him as this like terrible guy who is, you know, profoundly altered people's lives. And I guess that was kind of my goal with the story, was to underscore the human, kind of, what you normally see about these guys, or it's changing a little bit now as these issues kind of are sort of having a cultural moment, which is a good thing. Um, but sort of in the past, it would always be seen through the athlete, the prism of kind of the athlete, like, oh, that guy, he's in prison, he screwed up. Um, whereas really, I mean, that's, it's a total, you know, I mean, I don't know how to put it, but it's not, validating the pain that they cause these other people. So that was kind of my goal with the story. I found a couple of his victims, and spoke to them, and I really wanted to kind of bring out the full dimensions of this tragedy that sort of couldn't possibly come across in what had already sort of been printed out there.
Now, when you interview these people, do you do it like via Skype where you record this stuff? Because I would think that, I mean, someone like Megan and Hall, I think they've both been jailed or whatnot, so I guess they couldn't sue you for libel. But let's say if
Right.
they hadn't been convicted and you were doing these kinds of stories, you would have to have some kind of proof. I mean, did you actually like fly to meet some of the people, or or speak to people in prison, or?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's been one of another guy that went down on a sex charge. This guy Chad Curtis that played for the
Oh
Yankees.
yeah, yeah,
I did interview in prison. I wrote about him last year. Um, but I mean, if they've been convicted in a court of law, I mean, obviously you keep an open mind. But if they have been convicted, the presumption is that they're guilty. I mean, still
yeah.
you go into it with a somewhat open mind. I mean, but you're not going into it, to write the story that Dave Meggett actually got railroaded, and
Mm,
that all these women are making it up.
yeah,
If that angle presents itself, which frankly it didn't.
yeah.
But if that angle presents itself, then then you're duty bound to pursue that.
Yeah.
But
Well,
there's
like
a
there was
scale to
that current story. There was that story about the woman who wrote a story September about, was it the University of Virginia sex scandal that turned out not to be any kind of scandal? So there's always that kind of thing. Well, we'll get more into depth about the Megan and Hall pieces a little bit later. Let me just ask like two final questions in this segment. What well, now you guys both look like you're in your early 30s. I just turned 50, so I know as I've gotten older, things like sports and things like music, popular music, don't mean as much to me. And I'm just wondering, as you've gotten older, do you take a more, if you start out as a Yankee fan or a Cub fan or a Bears fan or a Bulls fan, whatever, do you, as you've gotten older, do you find yourself being more or less drawn to these stories, or do you think that with age and perspective, it aids you as a journalist so that you're not going in with the same kind of naivete that you would say if you were just coming out at 24, 25 and approaching these stories? Noah or Greg, if you want.
I can, yeah, as someone that, I grew up like a huge Mets fan and Giants fan, and then, I found Giants locker room. Here were like my heroes, like, naked, like, so I've kind of had that moment where the two sort of worlds meet each other of, the kind of little kid in awe and the, the grown up professional who's a decade older than the, it is sort of a weird juxtaposition going on there. I find they sort of naturally, it's sort of two parts of the brain at work, and they kind of naturally separate themselves. The little kid in awe will live on, but it kind of has nothing to do with the professional, so it's just not hard for me to separate that. As far as do I care about as much about sports? No, I mean I don't think anyone sort of could, just because your life kind of gets bigger and you get more, and you just sort of get perspective.
Yeah.
But I still really, really like sports. Like I fell asleep in front of the Met game last night. I mean, I still into it. It's just, to be honest, it's like a different approach. Like when you're writing a story about Dave sporting event on TV. I mean, it's just a totally different, no pun intended. It's a totally different ball game.
Yeah.
So, I mean, yeah, that's a good question. You'll hear people in this business saying that they're disillusioned and they just don't care about sports because they're sort of tired of dealing with sports on, constantly on a professional level. But I don't, sort of most of my mental energy with my writing and reporting has very little to do with like what happens on the field. So I guess for that reason, I'm able to maintain, an interest that I've always held, since I was 4 or 5.
Okay, how about you, Noah?
I think we're not. Yeah, I mean, I think being a beat writer is very different from sort of what Greg and I do. I mean, I think I have incredible respect for people who, are in the Yankees locker room every day, or in the Mets locker room every day, or in the Nets locker room every day, writing stories, and I think for me, there would be a fatigue with that. I think you saw it a little bit with the New York Times this year when the Knicks were terrible and they sent their beat writer. They just said, we're going to try to have him watch some good basketball. So they sent him all over the world, and I love that series.
Yeah.
But I think for what Greg and I are doing, and sort of the best long form stuff. Not that we're the best, but hopefully that we're approaching it. It's not really about sports. I mean, sports is the framework for it, but like Greg said, you're talking to the women who, were involved with Megan, and even a story about Shep Messing, the goalie for the Cosmos. That's about sports, but it's really just a profile of Shep. I mean, it's not that different from he's famous because he was an athlete, but it's a story about him, and even the story about the soccer game in Germany. I mean, that's about the soccer game, but that story is really about everything else that's around it. So it's not so much about sports, I don't think.
Well, let me ask a final question, and then we'll end this segment. Do you find sports to be a handier metaphor in your writing than, say, if you're writing about politics, or if you're writing about, if you were to write about a protest at an abortion clinic, or a Greenpeace protest, or the prime minister from Kenya is visiting the governor of the state or whatnot? Do you find sports gives you an easier or better or more insightful angle into the human condition, or not, or is it all or is it just another avenue? Noah.
I think sports is a it's an easy touchstone for a lot of people. I mean, you don't have to, you can sort of get into a lot of people know the rules of soccer, or a lot of people know the rules of baseball. So I don't think it's a metaphor. I mean, I think
No.
I think the importance of sports is overblown in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
I think it's sort of like I said, I think it's a common thing that a lot of people have in common. So it's an easy way in to something that is sort of a collective understanding. But I don't think that sports is a metaphor for how we live or anything like that.
Okay. How about you, Greg?
Yeah, I think that's a great point about the touchstone. It's a bunch of names and a bunch of characters that so many people recognize, and so sort of immediately you have that kind of familiarity where people sort of say, oh, I know that guy.
Yeah.
I'll read about this. As far as how difficult or easy it is, I think it is easier writing about than like right now I'm working on a story on a New York political figure of the last like 40 years, and that I'm having some trouble with because it sort of presents itself with a lot of decisions because of kind of the inherent thorniness and complication of politics,
Yeah.
that sort of everything is, was this a good thing that I mean, it kind of presents all these sort of very fundamental questions that you kind of have to wrestle with and answer before you assert things. Whereas sports is, it's not the most complicated thing, and that's why we like it. It's simple and straightforward.
Yeah, I know. I have a website, and I've learned over the years that unfortunately you can't tell the truth unless you can prove it in this life. When I was growing up, there was a New York politician who was in bed with the mob, literally, and I'm just waiting for the bastard to die so I can write a nicely about him. But I'll have to wait until death takes him. So let's end this segment, and in our next history of sports writing, the essay form, and both of your approaches to writing in general, how not just the subject matter, but how, what the topic is you're writing, whether it's about the Nazi soccer game, or whether it's about some criminal sports person, how that affects how you decide to frame or approach into the story. And we'll do that in our next segment. Right, back with Noah and Greg, and in this segment, any kind of art, and journalism is a specific kind of art. It's well, it's not, you can't be too creative, but I do want to talk about how stories are structured, and we can talk about some of the stories, and I will link to both. I will link to Noah's website, and I will link to the stories mentioned here on SB Nation long form below this video. But I want to talk a little bit about the history of sports writing and also how stories are approached. But why don't we talk about the writing itself? Noah, when you do a story like the Shep Messing story, and it's not going to be as gloomy and gritty as the two stories I mentioned that Greg did. Do you come in with an idea for the story, or do you get the facts and then say, well, if I lead off, let's say if Messing had some famous public incident, do you lead off with something like that and then go back and start at the beginning? Shep Messing was born in 1947 or whatnot. How do you structure stories, and do you find that certain kind of approaches in the stories work better with sports, work better with political, etc.?
I mean, I usually do all the reporting first, and then I go for a run. And when I'm on the run, I think about the story, and it just kind of all works out from there. I mean, the Shep Messing story, it's a profile, and I spent a lot of time with him just kind of hanging out. So at some point, you hope that one of those scenes is sort of worthy of leading off the story, and then you can kind of work back from there. I mean, I'm doing another profile of a American soccer player right now, and that's pretty similar. I went and hung out with him at his, in his apartment building on Wednesday, and I'm going to go watch him play a game on Thursday, next Thursday, and so I think you just kind of keep an open mind, and what you have to get in there. You have to get those biographical details. You have to get sort of why this guy's important, but you also have to keep the pace going and keep it up and keep the flow, and I don't think that you have an idea of exactly how it's going to go when you first start out, and even if you do, that frequently changes.
What of all the stories that you've done, Noah, has there been a story that stumped you in structuring, whether it was because you didn't have all the facts at the moment, that if you had a deadline, or just you had this agglomeration of facts and whatnot, and you're like, where the hell do I begin? And how long did it take you to sort it through and get the key, the end to the story?
I think one of the other stories I did for SB Nation was a story about the soccer game in 1980. It was the first time the U.S. had beat Mexico. First draft of that, was not great. I just didn't have enough information, because most of the players who played in that are not living anymore. And a couple of the ones that I did, is a soccer game that was relatively little consequence 35 years ago, and so even the guys who are still living, they didn't really remember the game, and so I had to go back to them a couple times and just sort of keep asking questions and keep going. And so I don't think I've been stumped in terms of the format of a story. I think there have definitely been some times where you sit down to write and you realize that you don't have enough information, and then you have to go back and get it again.
How about you, Greg? Getting back to my original question, how does the facts of a story, how does the central thesis of a story affect how you will approach it, whether it's sports or otherwise?
Yeah, I think while you're doing your reporting, I mean, there are certain, as Noah said, scenes, or just sort of themes that really jump out at you, that that you want to emphasize. And then, kind of from that point, I mean, it's pretty sort of sloppy and panicked and like messy. But you kind of want to just sort of begin to craft it kind of based around some of those things, and based around, as Noah said, the information that you want, that you feel you need to get in. But a lot of it is sort of trial and error. I mean, most of I spend kind of most of my time, like, period, like in life, with, like, various false starts on writing and various, but you kind of never know how the pieces are going to snap together. And I would just sort of say that, putting foot in front of the other is kind of the only tried and true, like, method that works. I mean, I kind of, wish there was some sort of magic formula, but kind of constantly exerting the effort and putting one foot in front of the other, and then just sort of seeing, like, what works, and kind of at the end of the day, if something just, like, works, like, that's, at least a place to start. And then a lot of your kind of anxieties about the kind of the structure and the flow. I mean, if it sort of works basically, then you can kind of, build off of that framework. But until then, yeah, I mean, it's a lot of, throwing, stuff against the wall and seeing what sticks.
Yeah. Has there ever been a story that you thought, when you were given an assignment, or it just came to you, said, "Oh, this is going to be an easy one. I know most about this," and then the more you dug, it became sort of a tar baby that you're like, "Jesus Christ, I should have
Yeah.
gotten this done a month and a half ago, and I'm still."
Yeah,
Well,
yeah. A lot of that. I mean, sometimes that, like the one that I'm working on now, for instance, it's about a politician, and in a way, I kind of know too much, and I've been sort of thinking about this guy for too many years of my life.
uh,
even before I started reporting this. So it's hard to kind of get that distance and that perspective to say, these, 3, 4, 5 things are this important, and to kind of get the hierarchy of things that are important, because you're a little, I mean, currently I'm like a little too immersed in the material and everything, you lose kind of that perspective. So yeah, it's a struggle. I mean, I think one thing that most good writers like is good editors of their own stuff, and you just kind of know when you read it, if it, you just kind of have that level of honesty with yourself, that when you read it, is this good enough, or is this missing something? Does this not get there? Is this too much in one area and too little in another area? And you kind of, can work backwards from that. But of course, there's no working backwards from that unless you kind of have it down to begin with. So I guess in terms of, advice for young writers, which is also advice for myself, just put one foot in front of the other and just get like something, try your best, even if what you're producing, even while you're producing it, is not meeting your expectations.
Just start
which is sort of one of the difficult things about writing. I mean, you sort of, you do all this reporting, great story, and then inherently what you put on paper is going to be like worse than your, ideal vision for what it was going to be, and that's kind of a punch to the stomach, to kind of deal with initially. But you just gotta kind of get over it and work from it, work with it from there.
Yeah, let's step back a moment then, talk about a little bit more, take a broader view of sports writing. I had mentioned, I believe, earlier when we started the interview that I had found the SB Nation long forms just probably percentage-wise, out of maybe 120, 140 that there have been, there are probably, 70 or 80 high-quality stories and 20 or 30 that are just really great, that really stuck in my mind. There was one about the XFL, the death of that. There was one about some fellow who was killed in a football game, a black fellow in an Iowa-Minnesota football game. There were a few others, yours and a fellow who was going to be on the show but couldn't. His stuck in my mind. What do you think it is about SB Nation versus a lot of some of these other outlets, even some of the ESPNs and the Sports Illustrateds and the Fox Sports? Do they encourage you to do in depth? Whereas if you were writing for Fox Sports, I've never seen anything on Fox Sports that's as in depth as some of the stories on SB Nation. What is it about SB Nation or the editorial policies that has fostered this atmosphere? Either of you.
I can speak to that. Glenn Stout's the editor at SB Nation, and he's the guy that is the series editor of the Best American Sports Writing book, which is that book that you'll see in Barnes and Noble every holiday season, along with Best American Crime Writing and Best American Short Stories and all that. And he really kind of brings that sensibility, and he demands that excellence, and he expects that excellence, and that's just sort of part of the operation. Like he's not messing around. And I think kind of part of that expectation, as opposed to other outlets, is that it's not sort of it's kind of aspires to this to this real high place, as opposed to just sort of something that works commercially. And that's something that I'm sure Noah and most of the other SB Nation long form people would agree with, that it's a real sort of purist view of the whole enterprise.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry.
And kind of Glenn in particular, he's a kind of poetry guy by trade, or he started as that, and he kind of brings over this real sort of like sensory audible perspective, that he really kind of wants the story to be immersive, not just in terms of the information, but just in terms of the sound of it and in terms of the flow. And he's incredibly hands-on as an editor, and I'm sure a lot of us would say that they've learned a lot just from kind of talking through things with him. So I the guy in charge of the program, and I give him a lot of credit for just sort of how consistently excellent the stories are.
Noah?
Yeah, Greg said it. I mean, Glenn is a wonderful editor. I also think it's sort of a matter of scale too. I mean, they're doing sort of one story a week, and then they're very, very good stories. But there's a lot of stuff. You mentioned Fox. I mean, I think Fox has had some good long form stuff. Grantland. I think there's a lot of places that are sort of doing this kind of long form thing and doing it pretty well. I don't know if it's sort of at the level of quality as SB Nation, but there's also a lot of stuff on SB Nation in terms of their other sites that is sort of this quick hit stuff. So I think to kind of I don't know if I would hold SB Nation up to like this wonderful standard. I mean, I think that SB Nation long form stuff is wonderful, but I think there's wonderful stuff out in a lot of different places as well.
Well, as just I still read sports. The thing with Grantland, just it's to me, it's much too pop culture, and they I've read some good pieces here and there, but they try to mix television and celebrity culture with sports in ways that sometimes produce these monstrosities. And so I, just as someone who as a writer and a reader, that's why I appreciate the SB Nation stuff. But let's pull back a little bit and talk about some maybe sports writers that have influenced you, since you're both currently in New York. Are you both native New Yorkers? Did you grow up both? No?
I'm not. No.
No.
Massachusetts.
I grew up in the city, and I live in Jersey, so I got
okay.
promoted across the Hudson.
Okay, because I know when I grew up, I was born in 1965. That Dick Young was a big sports writer for the New York Daily News, and then Mike Lupica came along in the mid to late 70s. And I then later lived in the Midwest, out in the Twin Cities, as a fellow named Sid Hartman, who I never thought too much of as a sports writer, but he was a big name out there. What sports writers influenced you, or if you if they did, if there was a sports writer, or if not a sports writer, any other kind of journalist, were there any people that you looked to and said, I want to go for that kind of career arc? Either of you want to take that?
I yeah, I mean, I never, like, I did read the papers growing up, but I didn't, I didn't sort of want to be one of those guys who had to bang out a column after every game, and kind of, I kind of knew, I guess, from an early age that a lot of that stuff was a little kind of too overheated for me, and that I wanted kind of more of a, of a reflective, I guess, sensibility. I always sort of like read books, and I majored in English in college, and I sort of consider myself like a general like reader. And there wasn't really anyone that I guess you're sort of always modeling things, but this tone worked for describing this, but there was sort of no one, I never kind of tried someone else's style on for size. Really, a big kind of a, like, my favorite sports book is by Mark Bowden, who's the guy who did Black Hawk Down, and he's that, and he wrote this book on the Eagles of the early 90s called Bringing the Heat, which is just an incredible book, and it's not well known because the team, even though it had high expectations to win a Super Bowl, they wound up not doing anything. But that's like a really, really great book. So if I had to, it's kind of it's a journalist fly on the wall account, but just so in depth, and the characters are just like so well developed, and it's it's kind of both like very funny, but very empathetic, and it sort of shows the absurdity and of the whole enterprise, but also really makes you kind of feel what these players feel, and it's just really great. So if I had to pick one kind of book that's sort of a Bible, I would choose that. But I was not influenced by the newspaper columnists. I never really thought that they're sort of from an early age, I realized that they were under a lot of pressure to produce copy day after day, and that their opinions didn't really for me or reflect my opinions about the games.
How about you, Noah?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think it's similar. I didn't kind of grow up thinking I was going to be a sports writer. I sort of still don't think I'm a sports writer when people ask me. But I think you know Bill Simmons was pretty influential in sort of that everyman sports writer kind of way. I agree with you in sort of the pop culture stuff and the references and all of that. It's a little overwhelming, but I think in terms of kind of thinking about sports from a fan perspective or someone who actually really likes sports, I think he did that really well. And I think, like Greg was saying, I mean, sort of you read the beat reporters and you can tell they're so tired and they're so sick of covering the same, they're being in the same locker room and, sort of the Dan Shaughnessy of the Boston Globe. I mean, I definitely didn't want to be that guy. So I don't know if there were people that I wanted to be, but I think there were people that I didn't want to be. And in sort of that reactionary kind of quick hit stuff is definitely something that I've tried to avoid.
Yeah, I know. I read Sports Illustrated as a kid from the early to mid '70s on, and I noticed sort of a kind the seriousness of sports writing in there. And for me, the archetype of the guy who just got bored with it all is Rick Riley. I mean, I think he deserves some of his accolades early in his career, but I think a few years ago when he signed off 2 or 3 years ago on Sports Illustrated, I mean, he'd spent most of the last decade just writing these little fluffy pieces that were more about how great he is and how it wasn't about anything really. And so I think both of you mentioned how a lot of these columnists they have the beat reporters have to bang it out too. But I think that's one of the things that is good about the long form is that it forces both the writer and the reader to be more immersive and not just have 800 words and a little cutesy ending. You're getting into the meat. So that's just my opinion as a sports reader. So why don't we end this segment, and when we get back, since I mentioned meat, let's get and talk about some of the meat of the stories, the three SB Nation pieces, and we can talk about any other pieces that you want to maybe talk from your own oeuvre, and we will do that in just a moment. And I am back with Greg Hanlon and Noah Day, written long form pieces for a website called SB Nation. And in this final long section here, we're going to talk a bit more in depth about those pieces as well as other pieces and website that Noah has. So let me start with Greg. The two pieces that we'd mentioned before about Mel Hall, an outfielder for the New York Yankees in the '90s, and Dave Meggett, the running back on I think it was the second Giants Super Bowl championship in 1990. I know the thing that struck me was back in the '90s, everyone knew Mel Hall was a scumbag. It was out in the open. And when I found the Meggett story, I had no idea. So my reaction to both of them was basically like, well, the Mel Hall was interesting, but everyone knew he was a slime bag to begin with. Whereas with Meggett, he was seemingly well regarded, and he ends up this O.J. Simpsonian. He didn't commit murder, I guess, but a little bit lesser O.J. Simpson type. So let's get into those stories a little bit. We talked a little bit about the Meggett piece. Was that one of the differences in writing the stories? What are the similarities between the two cases? And was the fact that the Meggett story was lesser known to the general public, was that something different, and did that help structure the story different than the Hall story? Or?
Um, I didn't sort of start with that assumption because Meggett was a little more contemporary for me, for closer to my kind of fan experience. And I had sort of vague, I mean, everyone knew Hall was a bad guy, but just sort of the mind blowing extent of his, of the way he mistreated people, I think I think again when you sort of read about these things in the paper with a quick AP news item, it's not a visceral experience, and so I wanted to make both of these things like visceral experiences. And a lot of it sort of depends on what the source material that you have. Megget was I mean they were both rapists. Megget was more of a predatory nature, was a lot sort of more grooming and psychological. And so I guess the big was showing, it was kind of in the nature of the attacks. And
Well, wasn't Hall also a pedophile or an ephebophile? Wasn't he going for teenage girls? Was
he was
Megan at
yeah
least?
he was going for teenagers. So to the extent that he was, yeah, I mean, by definition, having relations with an underage girl is rape, is sexual assault. But Hall, wasn't you know pinning women down by their hair
Yeah.
and forcibly doing that. But yeah, I mean, I think with the Megget thing, I mean, kind of what jumped out at me from the police reports and from the women that I talked to was just the horror of the violence, and that also dovetails with football also. These guys that kind of speak the language of violence. So I wanted to bring that out in the Megget thing. The Hall was a little more psychologically nuanced. It was about coming from nothing and being richer than your wildest dreams, and just kind of the grandiosity, and the narcissism inherent in that, and how that sort of plays out, with this guy's sex drive and just the ideas of limits and entitlement. So those were sort of the more thematic focus of those of that story. Power as well. Power, sort of in both things. Megget kind of as his career, or I'm sorry, as after his career, kind of rapidly lost money and lost status, and so that coincided with his sexual assaults kind of becoming more violent and more brazen. So just the idea of losing power. You always hear about how rape isn't about sex so much as it's about power. I found that really came across with the Megget thing, that you sort of saw this kind of desperate attempts to validate his power in these violent, awful rapes. So I wanted to bring that across. But I mean, it's just sort of to go back to answer your question. It kind of depends on the source material that you have, and just kind of where does that source material lead you? Like what kind of what's going through your head when you read those police reports? I mean, what are the themes? What are the ideas that are knocking around? And from there, you want to bring those out in the storytelling.
Now, Megget was a teammate of Lawrence Taylor, and Lawrence Taylor, the famous Hall of Fame linebacker for the Giants, and arguably one of the two or three greatest defensive players in NFL history. He too, I don't think he did violent rape, but he was more like a Mel Hall. Was there, in your digging into Megget, did you find anything out about Taylor? Because since they both were teammates, was there like some unspoken silence, like they say the thin or the thick blue wall, or the for cops who will cover for
Yeah,
each other,
no,
this mafia?
I
Did the sports writers sort of know about LT and Megget and maybe someone else and say, well, we're not going to report this? Did you find anything out like that?
I no, nothing at all. I mean, there was some stuff with perhaps preferential treatment from a local judge in Jersey, like right near the Meadowlands, when Megget allegedly assaulted a girlfriend. But in terms of players and coaches covering it up, I don't think. I think these guys are sort of more colleagues than friends,
Hmm.
and similarly, I mean, if you have a guy in your office who's a terrible guy when he's not there, but is a smiling, friendly, nice guy when he's there, then you're going to like him, and you're going to say that he's a nice guy, and that was certainly the case with Megget. I mean, around the facility, he was a pleasant, he was a hardworking player. He was a good player, which goes a long way in just sort of getting people to think favorably
Yeah.
about you. And he was just, generally a nice guy in that particular compartment of his life. Um,
Now Hall, when he was with the Yankees were pretty bad. This was pre their dynastic late '90s run. I think Hall was in what '91 to '94, something like that. And
mhm.
uh, do you think that his bad behavior was revealed more because the Yankees were bad at the time, whereas the Giants during that era were a consistent playoff team? Do you think that had anything to do with, or was it just Mel Hall was just more outrageous and flamboyant?
I think Hall had a thing. I don't think it has to do with the how good the respective teams were. I just think that Hall's personality was such that he liked to push limits and get away with things in plain sight, and that he was just, I think, one of the Steve Sachs was one of the teammates that I talked to, and he described Hall as an instigator,
Yeah.
and I thought that was a good word. He was just one of these guys who liked to be, he liked to stir up discomfort and to kind of get a rise out of people. And I think, I mean, the shocking thing about the Hall thing is that he was dating this teenager, and everyone, I mean, that was in plain sight.
Yeah,
Everyone,
I believe in your story that were her parents supportive of it, something like that.
her parents were supportive of it, and the Yankees in their yearbook included a picture. I mean, this is like, it totally blows your mind. In their '91 yearbook, the Yankees included a picture of Hall and the girl at her junior prom. And Hall was like, 30-year-old man, and she was, 15, 16 or whatever. So I think a lot of that goes back to the fact that this was, 1990 or whatever it was, and it was just a different era in terms of awareness of these things. Um, and we've come a long way, and that's a very good thing. But 1990 wasn't that long ago, and
Yeah.
the fact that kind of people thought Mel Hall was a weird dude, but not like an abusive guy, um, is troubling, and it's worth remembering for sure.
Let's just talk about then, wrapping up with Meggett and Hall. Uh, what were both of these guys' backgrounds, and where are they now? Did they both start off like poor farm boys from Iowa or something, and are they both now currently in jail?
Um, yeah, both of them started. Both of them grew. They're Yes, they are both currently in jail. They will both be in jail for the next 20 years. I forget the specifics, but the
Uh,
next, they'll be very old men before they
yeah.
before they get out of jail. Um, they both did grow up poor. Hall was from the Finger Lakes region,
Mm.
in upstate New York, and Meggett was from North. Well, this is in the news in North Charleston, South Carolina. And he, yeah, I mean, Meggett, grew up quite poor. But he never, I mean, in terms of red flags about his, he wasn't like delinquent at all. I mean, he was a hardworking guy, who sort of kept on a straight and narrow path, except when it came to his relationships with women. And I think, I mean, that's not unique to athletes, but that's, an age old downfall is men who don't, handle maturely the opposite sex.
Yeah. Now, Noah, let's turn to you, and we'll start with your Shep Messing tale, and then talk a bit about your other writing and website. Um, what for people who may want to read it? What was the basic focus? Shep Messing was the goalkeeper of the New York Cosmos in the late '70s, and the North American Soccer League had this 4 or 5 year meteoric rise, and then just the league dropped dead in the early '80s. So, was that the focus of your story, or what?
Yeah, so Shep Messing is a guy who was the goalkeeper on that team that had Pele and Beckenbauer and a bunch of sort of, they were the first team of global superstars.
Yeah.
They're like kind of, at Real Madrid. I mean, they were the biggest soccer team in the world for a
Yeah.
very brief period. Spending
Giorgio
tons of money.
Canaglia.
Yeah, exactly. And and they were a wonderful soccer team, but they were also, they partied off the field. They went to Studio 54. They were sort of the social center of New York in the late '70s in a lot of ways. And Messing was, he was kind of Pele's right hand man. He was, he's a guy who grew up on Long Island, very charismatic, very sort of flamboyant in goal. Not the best goalie in the world, but he did it with style, and he had a flair. And he was the guy that brought them all to Studio 54. He was sort of their entree into this very cool side of New York. And since then, he has gone on. He's had a bunch of different business ventures. He's a commentator for the Red Bulls. He does some stuff with the new version of the New York Cosmos. And he is also still Pelé's man in the U.S. In terms of their business ventures. They have, I think, and but also a very fascinating guy. He's had some run-ins with the law.
Drugs,
You know,
or what was
no,
it,
with
something serious?
agents and sort of some money issues,
Hmm.
fraud and stuff like that. And but is still kind of. I mean, he's an incredibly nice guy. He went to Harvard. How he got in exactly is sort of up for debate. When I was reporting the story, I went up to Harvard and looked through his yearbook, and there's some great photos that are in the piece, of his old yearbook page. And he is just sort of this. He's this figure in American soccer, who anyone knows. Anyone of a certain age and anyone who sort of knows about the Cosmos, who are still a huge, one of the biggest soccer teams in the U.S. I think they're probably, if you went to Europe and you asked people about the Cosmos, I think they would know them before they would know a lot of MLS teams, maybe all of the MLS teams. And so it was sort of a, where are they now piece.
Yeah.
It's a little bit of going back. He talked a lot about his history. He
Well,
wrote a memoir, and read that memoir, and it was interesting kind of reading them out. The memoir was published in the early '80s. It was written with David Hershey, who's now an editor at HarperCollins, and kind of he does all the soccer books. And so it was interesting to talk to him and sort of see how the narrative is not quite shifted, but Shep is a guy who is he's very smart, and he's very media savvy, and he really understands what's going on, and he picks and chooses his anecdotes that he wants to tell, and so it's interesting to see kind of how those have shifted a little bit in terms of what he wants to get and what he wants.
yeah, I know. I remember because back in the late '70s, the Yankees were big with Reggie Jackson, and then I remember uh, when he hit the home run against the Red Sox in the '78 playoff. I remember he became a big star, and he and Shep Mess bachelors in New York at the time. I remember both of them did commercials for I think it was something called Fred the Furry, and both of them wore these like absurdly. They were like the biggest stars since Broadway Joe a decade earlier. They were like they were hawking everything in New York. But Messing was really the only American star on that Cosmos team. And Canaglia, who was their best player and goal scorer at the time, I remember he was from Italy, and Pele, of course, was Pele. And then they had like Beckenbauer, and I think they had two Johans, Cruyff and Naskins. And I wasn't even a big soccer fan, but does the story touch anything about how the league just sort of? I think it had been around for 7 or 8 years before Pele came. It rocketed, had 4 or 5 year run, and I think the Cosmos won two or three. I think they called them the Soccer Bowls, and then they overexpanded. It was sort of like the USFL or the World Football League and whatnot, and their whole financial infrastructure. Did these guys like Messing? Did they all of a sudden go from going to Studio 54, wearing fur coats and having supermodels on their arm, to just being Joe Nothings? And if so, how did Messing handle that?
Some of them did, yeah. I mean, Pele is always going to be Pele, and Canalia is always going to be Canalia. Um, Messing still carries himself like he's a star, and he played some indoor soccer. I think the late '80s, that was sort of when the trouble with the money started. So I think that's what happened. I think he has recovered in a nice way. Having being best friends with Pelé is comes with financial benefits as well. I mean, there's a lot of money in the Pelé brand, and so he's built that up. I don't know. It wasn't sort of as lucrative as it was, and they weren't making a huge amount of money. He wasn't making a huge amount of money even when he was playing with the Cosmos. The league folded because they paid Pelé too much, and it became this arms race for they were paying stars far too much, and they were paying guys who weren't stars more. But messing. He didn't make a whole lot of money during that time. So he's a hustler though, and I think he would tell you that proudly. And he's always been a hustler, and that's just what he does. He has his hands in a lot of different things, and he hopes that some of them pay off. So that's how he operates.
Yeah. Let me just end by asking. I know when I was a kid growing up, and when the North American Soccer League had that rise, people said, "Soccer's here. It's on this. It's going to be as big as the Big Four." Well, really, it's football, baseball, basketball, NHL in descending order of popularity, and for a brief moment, I guess the NASL maybe eclipsed the pre-Magic, pre-Bird NBA even, and maybe became the third most popular for 2 or 3 years. Do you think that, because I think the MLS, I remember there was the New York Arrows of the Indoor Soccer League. They won like 5 straight titles back when I was a kid. They played in the same, I think, Nassau Coliseum as the New York Islanders, who won 4 straight Stanley Cups. There was the home of champions then. But do you think that soccer and MLS is going to just always be a niche sport in America? Because as an American myself, I find soccer very boring, and I've just never been able to get into it. I mean, I've seen World Cup, and I remember growing up in New York listening to Spanish soccer, and the the South American guys would be, or the British guys would be 0-0. It's the most exciting game ever, and they'd be so someone would do a scissor kick or something, and they'd act like Babe Ruth hit a grand slam to win the World Series in Game 7. What do you think is the future of soccer in America? Do you think it will be a niche sport or grow or what?
I mean, I think it depends on what your definition is. I mean, MLS has better average attendance than the NBA. So, on that level, is it a niche sport? I don't know. I mean, I think in the U.S. you have the NFL, which is the dominant sport by far, and then you have a second tier, and that's the NBA, Major League Baseball, hockey to some extent, MLS somewhat. I mean, I don't know. The idea that soccer is going to take over is ridiculous, but it doesn't have to. I mean, there's 320 million people in this country. I mean, I think a lot of those people will watch soccer. I think MLS is here to stay, which is something that you maybe wouldn't have said definitely 10 years ago. I
Yeah.
think soccer is going to I think it's going to keep growing in popularity. In 50 years, I don't know. I think that, like I said, I think that I think the NFL is this dominant sporting entity, and then you have everything else. And I think that MLS and soccer in general is getting closer to being in that everything else with the NBA and with baseball and with hockey.
Yeah.
So I don't know where it ends up, but I do think that it's going to keep getting bigger. I don't think that it's going to be the dominant sport. But I don't think that matters. I mean, I think that's sort of the wrong question.
I think it was another SB Nation long form that I read recently in looking through the archive. And I'm pretty sure it was SB. Was on High which was another sport back in the 70s that had an amazing run for about 10 years, from the late 60s to the 70s in Florida and Connecticut. I remember commercials for Milford High, and then that sport has just dropped off. But let's talk a bit, Noah, before we get back to Greg. Let's just talk about your website here, because I've got it up online. It's noahedavis.com, noahedavis.com, and you've got it looks like here you got a blog, and you've got stories sorted by topic and whatnot. If you could just talk a little bit about the website and some of the stories that you have on there.
Yeah, a friend of mine who makes websites did it for me. Chet Clem, who does wonderful work. If you want to hire him, but it's just a repository for the stories, and sort of if you're pitching a story to an editor or something like that, it's nice to have them have a website that they can go to. I mean, I think I've a couple of things up there. I did a piece for the New Yorker about the New York Cosmos and the new New York Cosmos and the NASL. They're trying to become a major force in soccer in the U.S. I'm not exactly sure what else is up there. I did a piece about there's this squash player named Amanda Sobey, she's going to graduate from Harvard in a couple months. She's the 10th best squash player in the world. I did a piece about her for the New York Times. I did another piece about her and her sister, who's younger, 18. She's 50th in the world in squash for the Boston Globe magazine. Yeah, it's just I think a lot of writers have sort of their own sites that you can kind of highlight your best work.
Yeah, I'm seeing some stuff here about an art gallery owner, some things about someone with AIDS and whatnot. It looks like you've written for a place called Pacific Standard Esquire magazine, the All Media Bistro, Open Skies. So uh, let me go back to Greg and just talk about any other piece that you want to talk about. Uh, what outside of sports? Let's just take a little step outside of sports, then, Greg. What piece would you say is your best or most interesting piece that anyone who's looking you up, if they, let's say, if an editor wanted to look at your best stuff and hire you, what are you the most proud of? Say.
A number of years ago, I wrote a piece about a public school in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, an elementary school, sort of right at the or I guess what was then, it was 5 years ago now, in Williamsburg and Brooklyn, everything, the waves of gentrification move eastward with rapidly, so that what was the epicenter 5 years ago is now no longer. But I wrote a story about a school and the conflict between the kind of newcomer parents and the pre-existing community, and the mostly basically broke down as the mostly Latino parents and the mostly white parents, and the white parents kind of came into the school with all these sort of very grand plans and noble ideas, and they were very excited and very sort of anxious about bringing the school, which had sort of poor test scores, kind of up to standards that they were sort of more comfortable with, but they didn't do it in a very sensitive way, and sort of because of that, there were all sorts of these kind of territorial disputes that really undermined, what should have been good for both parties, a spirit of collaboration and making the school the best possible place it could be. So I sort of use that as a kind of window into some of the racial tensions surrounding the gentrification of Williamsburg, which is sort of a story that you'll see repeated, in different parts of New York and in different parts of the country now that, millennials and Gen Xers are sort of moving into cities and having kids. So I was very proud of that one. It's called The Struggle for PS 84. Okay. And it's about misunderstanding and control and good intentions on both sides gone awry.
And Noah, if there was one story that you'd want people to read outside of the ones that we've spoken of, whether it's in sports or out of sports, what would that be?
Oh man. I honestly, this is not a good answer, but I would say the story about the soccer team, the soccer game in Germany. That's I think my favorite story that I've written so far. I really liked how it came out, and it was something that I had never heard of, and I thought it was really cool. And I also think the design of it is really nice too, how it all comes together and how sort of the archival stuff that I found works.
Okay. Well, let's end this segment, and when we get back, we'll close the interview with closing remarks from Noah and Greg, and we'll do that in just a moment. All right, well, we're going to wrap up this interview with Greg Hanlon and Noah Davis, who have written for SB Nation, the sports site. So let me just ask both of you, what do you have coming up in the future? Your future plans? Are either of you working on any books in sports or out of sports, or either of you in line to get a job with the New York Times or the Boston Globe or anything? Well, either one of you want to, Noah, you want to jump in? Or?
Yeah, I think I'm pretty far back in that line for the New York Times job. What am I doing? I'm doing a thing for the next issue of Howler magazine, which is a soccer magazine, a small startup soccer magazine. It's quarterly. I'm pretty excited about. That was I mentioned it earlier, the player I hung out with on last week. It was for that. I've started doing some stuff for 538 as well, which is the ESPN, the Nate Silver site. I do that with a friend who is a stats professor at Skidmore, and we sort of do a combination of um, data. It's data journalism. You know, he does the sort of the charts and things, and I do the reporting. We just did a piece about NHL overtime, and basically it turns out that hockey teams, if the game is tied in near the end of the third period, they stop trying to score so that they can go to overtime and get an extra point.
Yeah, the loser point.
Exactly, the loser point. And it sort of it's interesting how it does it. It depends on if they're in if the team is in your conference and stuff like that. So I talked to a couple players and some coaches about essentially how they stop trying to say it's not so much that they stop trying to score, but they really want to they don't want to lose. So the way to not lose is to not try very hard on offense, so you can play defense. And so I've been doing a bunch of stuff for 538 as well that I'm excited about.
How about you, Greg? What do you have coming up?
That's totally fascinating and makes like completely perfect sense about that loser point. Getting conservative strategy. That's great. I look forward to reading that. I have a long story on this. Without kind of giving away too many details, but this corrupt longtime New York City politician that we had talked about, and sort of traces the arc of both this guy's rise and fall, and also his the neighborhood that he kind of built up and enabled to take off. So I wanted to sort of tie that into sort of this guy's pathologies.
Well, send me a link when that story comes up. I'd love to read that. And one of these days, when the guy I mentioned dies, I'll contact you. But go ahead.
Absolutely. Maybe we're talking about the same guy. But yeah. So that's that's kind of my immediate focus. I hope to have that done within a week or something. And other than that, I've actually been looking into putting together a documentary. Although I have no film experience, I've been talking to film people and about a Major League Baseball team in the '80s and kind of their, again without getting into detail, but sort of tying in their style of play with the ethos of the era and kind of the popularity with tying that into kind of what was happening in the city at the city that they came from at the time. So that's another project that I'm working on that I'm.
Well, I actually did, before I did these video interviews, I did 41 written interviews, and I actually interviewed 4 or 5 documentary filmmakers. There was one fellow who actually did a documentary on the Mothman unexplained phenomenon thing. That was actually one of the best documentaries. It blew my mind. And so if you have any problems finding something, I know this guy, and I can at least put you in touch with him, because he runs a company in New York, actually, in I think it's in Long Island City area. It might be. So if let me know if you get. If you need any help, I can at least put you some name. But let me just final question for both of you. If you had one like dream interview in sports or out of sports, if you could interview one person currently living, who would it be, Noah?
I am fascinated by this guy, Haile Gebrselassie. He's an Ethiopian runner. He was like the best long distance runner in the world, and I have been trying to get someone to send me to Ethiopia to interview him, or to London, for a very long time. It hasn't happened yet, but I think I'm getting closer. I think he's a fascinating guy, and he's become a businessman, and maybe eventually going to be president of Ethiopia. I think he's just a fascinating guy.
How about you, Greg?
Tough question. You mentioned this earlier. I mean, how about the exclusive jailhouse of O.J. Simpson? If he's up front with you, that would be a good one.
Yeah. So let me just give you then, guys, a final closing statement on anything. Greg, let's start with you. You don't have a website like Noah does, but I know people can look at your SB stuff at Longform. Well, actually, it's not. There's longform.org, writers or slash writer slash Greg dash Hanlon. I guess is that a website that a lot of writers have seen seem to put a lot of from different websites. Is that where you archive most of your longer stuff?
Well, it's actually the entity itself, longform.org, sort of, selects if it's worthy. If
Oh, okay.
if they deem your piece worthy, they select it.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, I mean that's a good question where someone could find my stuff. I probably should have a website, but I don't. So I don't know. Google me,
Yeah.
Greg Hanlon, journalist, Greg
Okay.
Hanlon, writer. Come up. Hopefully, it'll won't be that bad.
And Noah, as I mentioned, you have noahedavis.com. If any final words from you?
Uh, no, I have a newsletter, a tiny letter, that I send once every 2 weeks. I send the best thing that I read every day, and along with clips to whatever I've written in those 2 weeks. So if you want to do that, sign up for the tiny letter. I think it's tiny letter / Noah E. Davis, or you can just Google it or email me, noahedavis@gmail.com, and I'll
Okay.
hook you up.
Well, I want to thank both of you as entertaining and informative discussion. If you enjoyed this talk with Noah Davis and Greg Hanlon, next week we're going to be talking, or I will be talking about writing. I had a few years ago, I live here in Texas, and there's a writer named Elmer Kelton who is a well-known genre Western writer, but he's also a great writer outside the genre. And I'm going to be talking with two experts on his life as well as his son. So if you enjoy writing, come back in a week's time and I'll have more of it. But again, Greg and Noah, thank you for your time. And to my viewers, thank you.
Thanks for
Thank
having me.
you.